So welcome back, everybody, for our 10:30 panel on the very interesting and provocative question, is there a feminine genius? We're welcoming back to the panel speakers that you have already been introduced to, so I won't reintroduce Abigail Favale or Sister Anne Astell, but I will introduce our new panelists. First, Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble, who is a sister of the Little Way of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness, along with Sister Danielle Victoria Lucier. Sorry, I've just butchered that name. She has begun a new private association of the faithful with the mission of listening, outreach, and solidarity with people on the fringes or outside of the church, especially people who have been wounded, scandalized, or abused by members of the church. And you can see the work that they're doing on their website, sistersofthelittleway.com. And also joining us on the panel is Deborah Savage, Ph.D., who is professor of theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Dr. Savage is a student of St. Thomas Aquinas with particular interest in investigating his thought in light of contemporary questions, especially of relevance to us. One of her main research interests is precisely the nature of man and woman, and she also investigates questions more broadly, like the nature of the human person, the theological meaning of human work, and the conversion of the acting person. She's a recognized scholar of the work of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and has written and presented or published several papers on how his philosophical anthropology informs his body of work as Pope, as well as his understanding of human work, the complementarity of man and woman, and of the dignity and vocation of women. She's written and presented many talks and papers on these topics. Lest you wondered whether we had appropriate expertise on the panel, we clearly do. She has also just launched very exciting new Institute for the Study of Man and Woman with a lot of really helpful resources on these topics and a new website that has just recently been launched, so I would direct you to that for lots of interesting resources. And now I'll hand it over to Sister Theresa to start us off.
Is it okay if I stand up? Oh, yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah. Whichever
podium. I tend to flail when I talk, so I don't want to hit anyone. I'm going to be speaking about the role of women's genius in church reform. My faithful Catholic mother's fears came true when, as a young atheist just out of high school, I was accepted into Bryn Mawr, a women's college outside of Philadelphia. Little did my mother know my intellectual work at Bryn Mawr would be one major factor in leading me eventually to revert to Catholicism. My favorite building on the Bryn Mawr campus, the Great Library Hall, is lined with oil paintings of former presidents of the college. When I first noticed these paintings, it took me a while to realize that what was striking about them was the faces of so many women peered out. My 4 years at Bryn Mawr gave me many gifts, but one of the greatest was a historical perspective on women in society. It helped me to understand that my college education as a woman was something to be cherished and not taken for granted. The time I spent at Bryn Mawr was not only foundational in how I viewed the potential of my contribution to society, but also in how I viewed myself as a woman. As someone raised in a devoutly Catholic home, I can honestly say that sadly, the positive potential of my feminine contribution to society was not something that was emphasized to me in the context of the church. Colored both by evangelical Christian messaging and the charismatic renewal that my family was involved in, my understanding of gender taught me, if not explicitly but implicitly, that I was a misfit, that the intellectual and personality qualities I possessed as a woman were qualities better suited for a man, and therefore in need of modification within me rather than empowerment. Unfortunately, since my reversion almost 20 years ago, I've seen this messaging to women grow steadily in mainstream Catholic culture, and I'm deeply concerned about these developments. So when Abigail invited me to be on this panel, I responded positively because she told me she wanted to include someone who comes to the idea with some hesitation and skepticism. And I do, because in my view, how we frame discussions around the concept of the feminine genius and how I often have seen them framed, I believe can be to the detriment of women, especially when the feminine genius is spoken of solely in the ideal, rather than situated in the reality of the historical fallen context that informed why John Paul II felt the need to emphasize the importance of the feminine genius in the first place. In these introductory comments, I just want to focus on what I see as a development in the thought of the past 3 popes regarding the feminine genius, and I'll also explore how I believe the feminine genius can apply in our historical moment. At the closing of Vatican II, and this has been quoted, we heard that quote, "The hour is coming, in fact has come, when the vocation of women is being achieved in its fullness, the hour in which woman acquires in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved." Theologian Romano Guardini defined power as, quote, "real energies capable of changing the reality of things." And of course, women have always had the capacity and often the will to change the reality of history. But women's capacity to change reality has been limited and historically overlooked. Edith Stein puts this dynamic pretty bluntly when she wrote, quote, "The relationship of the sexes since the fall has become a brutal relationship of master and slave. Consequently, women's natural gifts and their best possible development are no longer considered. Rather, man uses her as a means to achieve her own ends in the exercise of his works or in pacifying his own lust," end quote. And the church has not been an exception to this reality. In his letter to women, John Paul II identifies what he calls a conditioning of history that, quote, "has been an obstacle to the progress of women. This conditioning," he argues, "has often, quote, relegated women to the margins of society and even reduced them to servitude." He apologizes on behalf of the church in cases where the blame for this maltreatment of women has, quote, "belonged to not just a few members of the church," end quote. Despite this conditioning, John Paul II argues that, quote, "the church's 2,000-year history has truly experienced the genius of women, who has left an impressive and beneficial mark in history." Here, John Paul II focuses on the positive impact of women's contribution to the church, while also acknowledging that women's contributions have been historically marginalized. I believe the connection that John Paul II makes here demonstrates something that is important, that the feminine genius cannot be detached from its expression by embodied women in a historical context and within a church in which their genius has been marginalized. Benedict XVI's papacy continued to emphasize the importance of the feminine genius, but I'm going to focus on a document he wrote before becoming pope as prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. In a letter to the bishops written by then Cardinal Ratzinger, he writes, quote, "The witness of women's lives reveal those values without which humanity would be closed in self-sufficiency, dreams of power, and the drama of violence." Interestingly, in Ratzinger's thought, and I don't have enough time to really expand on this, but self-sufficiency is connected with what he calls self-made or false reform in the church. In a lecture given to the Communion and Liberation movement, Ratzinger wrote, "A self-made church is reduced to the empirical domain, and thus precisely as a dream comes to nothing." So authentic renewal for Ratzinger entails removing what is not truly part of the church in the first place. And for Ratzinger, feminine values work against the elements of false reform in the church. In other words, I would argue that Ratzinger believes that the feminine genius is essential to genuine church reform. According to Ratzinger, reform is, quote, "the essential basis of church order that constantly needs to be developed and applied concretely." So reform for Ratzinger is always necessary in the church. If we accept that continual reform is needed in every moment of the church, then this particular moment in church history clearly provides evidence of this need for reform and renewal. Marked by an abuse crisis that began to unfold more than 40 years ago, nothing else makes clearer the need for reform than the abuse of children and adults by clergy and other church ministers, and its subsequent systematic cover-up by bishops. If Ratzinger correctly identifies feminine values as necessary to reform, then now more than ever we need women's participation in the church. Perhaps providentially, just as this crisis erupted in the church, societal changes have paved the way for expanding the potential areas of women's participation in the church. Continuing in the thought of Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Francis has made concrete steps to increase the influence of women and thus, hopefully, feminine values in the church. Interestingly, Francis explicitly connects the need for feminine values and systemic reform, saying, quote, "Women, by acquiring power in society, can change the system. if they succeed in converting power from the logic of domination to that of service and that of care. Francis's point here brings up a key aspect of necessary reform when it comes to abuse in the church: systemic reform, demonstrating a particular talent for implementing creative and concrete changes that increase feminine influence in the church, including in key systemic areas. Francis has appointed women in roles never before held by women in the Vatican. One recent example that applies very concretely to abuse cases is the appointment of Sister Simona Brambilla, the first female prefect in the dicastery for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, a role that was previously reserved for cardinals and archbishops. He has supported these changes by arguing, quote, "The feminine genius is needed wherever we make important decisions," end quote. As I close, I just want to be clear that I'm not arguing that the increased presence and influence of women in the church will necessarily prevent abuse. As the abuse crisis unfolded, you may have heard people say, well, if women were in charge, this never would have happened. This is a form of gender essentialism, which in my view is one of the biggest pitfalls of the popularization of John Paul II's feminine genius. To argue that men cannot act in nurturing, protective ways that respect the dignity of the human person without women in the room is simply false. As Ratzinger argues in the same letter to bishops that I quoted earlier, feminine values are, quote, more than simply an attribute of the female sex, but they rather designate, quote, the fundamental human capacity to live for the other and because of the other. Thus, in speaking of men's and women's roles in society and the church, I believe it's crucial to avoid an essentialism that suggests that men cannot live certain values without women and vice versa. However, if our embodied experience as women is important, as I believe it is, it seems clear that women can help men to live certain values through our embodied femininity and vice versa. Finally, I would add that though it's important to avoid gender essentialism, it's also important not to lose sight of the reality that John Paul II spoke of the feminine genius rather than a masculine genius for a reason. For most of human history, women have not experienced equal opportunities to participate in the life of society and the church, and it's important, if not crucial, to not lose sight of the historical perspective of this topic. As Vatican II acknowledges, we have reached, or whether I would say we're reaching toward, the time or the hour when women acquires in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved. If, as women, we succeed in taking up the challenge of this moment to contribute our lives and thus our feminine values to the life of the church, I believe that we will play a crucial role in the process necessary in every age, that of reforming our church for the next generation.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So I've been studying these questions since the publication or promulgation of Evangelium Vitae in 1999. So I have a lot to say. So it took me a little, I'm still not sure that I have the right thing, that I'm bringing the right thing, to be honest. I was trying to figure out what was the right contribution to make, and I thought I had a handle on it, and then I heard Abigail's paper. But, so I'm just going to go with what I planned, okay? So I have a slightly different, not take. I'm answering the same question that's on the table, which is, how do you talk about these things without reducing man and woman to stereotypes, right? That's really the fundamental question. I want to add, in defense of Paul Vitz and other people like him, that the neuroscience is fairly clear on some of the things that we want to say. And I also want to add something from von Balthasar, who says, God's a mystery. We're made in the image of a God who is a mystery. We are mysteries. But at the same time, he says in German, which I won't say because Angela's here, I never can pronounce it correctly. But he says you really need to give some wiggle room if you're going to be able to say anything at all about man and woman, because we're mysteries. But we've discovered ways we can talk about God, even though he's a mystery too, right? Okay. So he says, the final answer, the complementarity, the final union that we're seeking to understand, we can't achieve that by getting down to the nitty-gritty, finally finding the final answer is beyond our ken, because the final union we're seeking is actually God's work. So we just do our best, right? So we're all doing our best. The first thing I want to say, though, is that when the words feminine genius came out, actually in 1988, is the first place that in Mulieris Dignitatem that JP2 mentions anything like that, I knew right away he was onto something. It's phenomenologically available to anyone with a mom. There certainly is one, so let's answer that right away. But I think it's really important to point out, to Sister's point, actually, in a way, that the use of the phrase the feminine genius is really a rhetorical device. He's a philosopher, and he knows full well, as am I, he knows full well that you can't just assert something and not ask the question, what sort of attribute is that? Does it belong to the composite? Does it belong to the matter or the form? So he's trying to point to something that's very real, but in many ways has not actually given us a foundation or a place to start in terms of how we might go about boiling that down, if you will, to its fundamental meaning. So the jumping off place that I took from the Theology of the Body is found in the second and third audiences, where he says, in the second audience, he says, Genesis 1 is about man in the objective sense, man per se, man qua man. It reveals the meaning of the metaphysical reality that we refer to as man qua man. In the second account, he says it's about man in the subjective sense, in the psychological sense. Okay, there's much more to say about that, but that really intrigued me because he doesn't follow up on that claim. He says in the seventh audience, I'm not going to bother with that metaphysical anthropology stuff, so I'm interested. I'm like, okay, well, that's fine, I'll do it. That's right. I am woman, hear me roar, something like that. Okay. I like this audience a lot. Laugh at people's jokes, so I'm going to keep making them. But the second thing I realized along the way as I began my investigation is, wait a second, sorry about this, sister, what about the men? I mean, we really can't just leave them out. For one thing, von Balthasar points out something really profound, that we are organically united, the significance of the fact that woman is made out of Adam's rib means that we are organically substantially connected in creation. Without that connection, it's the one flesh union we seek is merely two bodies coming together. And in fact, our relationship is much more organic. Woman cannot be understood without reference to man. Sorry. Yeah, we kind of are a pair. So what does that mean? All right. So I proceeded to investigate, find out if he could really claim that Genesis 1 was about man per se and Genesis 2 was about man in the subjective sense. It required a return to the original Hebrew. It required a deep dive into Hebraic anthropology in order to understand what the Semitic author would have meant. And then, of course, as a Thomist, I took a look at his Genesis 1 and 2 through the lens of Aquinas' metaphysical anthropology. And I'm here to report that he is right. I knew he would be. But so the only thing I can really hope to do today is to give you some of my conclusions about how one might derive a masculine and a feminine genius from, especially and in particular, Genesis 1 and 2, or Genesis 2, I'm sorry. Genesis 1 definitely demonstrates that man and woman are equally human, instantiations of the same substantial form, equally endowed with intellect, will, and freedom. Indisputable. And why is this important? Because my work has been to see what you can derive actually from Scripture. Okay, I'm a theologian, and I think what I heard in theology school was that all good theology begins with Scripture. So there you go. That's what I tried. Okay. So I have your permission to proceed. Too late. I'm going to anyway. So, okay, now a couple of you asked me in the course of these days about the masculine genius idea, so that's another reason why I thought maybe that I could make at least this contribution. So the story begins in the fact that man is apparently in the garden. I'm going to start with man because he's first in the order of creation. So we're going to do that. Okay. So man is apparently in the garden alone with God for some time before the appearance of woman. And what is he doing? He's naming all the animals, right? Remember that part? And just to sort of cut to the chase, Aquinas says that he must have been given a distinct preternatural gift in order for him to be able to do that, to name all the animals. Now, what would that preternatural gift be? If this were a class, I'd make you raise your hand and answer the question, but it has to be infused knowledge, because it was infused knowledge that would have enabled him to see into the nature of reality and name the animals. And of course, this is how he goes about discovering that he's alone, and that's the meaning of original solitude. He's alone in the universe with all these creatures, mostly lower ordered creatures. But what does that reveal about man? It reveals that man is an expert on creation. The human man is actually, his gift is to be able to declare what something is, what can be attributed to it, and a systematic way of arriving at the matter. And by the way, I don't have time to go into it, this corresponds directly with the neuroscience and the ways in which men in particular think. So Adam, man, is the only one who gets a job, and his job is to till the earth and to keep it. But here's where the honey is in a way. Well, let me back up. I would say that as a result of this gift that man has, this is what has led man to be someone who, throughout history, has arrived at conclusions about any number of things. Man has created taxonomies, botany, anatomy, theology, philosophy, law. It's his gift to say, and those little baseball cards, where you kind of, just to bring it on home to a real life example, that's definitely a guy thing. My husband has boxes of tools, don't mess them up, right? Okay, so the neuroscience says men are oriented toward objects. Okay, here's evidence in Scripture of the significance of that. It's not just a deficiency, it's actually his gift. So picture, God says to Adam, okay, I want you to till the garden and keep it. This is Genesis 2:15. And Adam says, okay, for all of eternity, God? Yep. Just come out and weed the garden? Yep. Every day? Okay. But you're supposed to be laughing now, but that's okay. Here's the hook. It's not until woman appears that he knows what his gifts are for, right? He has no telos, really, until woman shows up. So his task is great. He's given this job, and he's really good at it. But it's only when woman appears on the scene that he realizes, oh, at last, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. The gifts that I have been given are gifts that are meant to be put in the service of her well-being and that of my family. I'm getting ahead a little bit of the story. So my argument would be that men, if you think about it, have sustained civilizations for history. Mistakes have been made. There's no question about that. But the man's drive to create, to produce, a man creates outside of himself. He has no other place to do it. He's oriented toward the outside. His seed literally leaves his body. And he knows in his heart of hearts that his task is to serve his family, the woman, the family, the community, the nation. Men have sustained civilization throughout history as a result of this noble gift that they've been given. They deserve our gratitude. It's because of men that we're sitting here in this beautiful building, well cared for, because you can be sure that the people that built this building were guys, right? Okay. I got more to say, but I'll go on. All right, so then at Genesis 2:24, woman, or 2:22, woman is created out of man's rib. And of course, as we know, he says, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. Here is the origin of woman's genius. Man's encounter with reality is of a horizon that only contains lower-ordered creatures, right? Things, what we call things. Res in the Latin is more meaningful, right? They have ontological status too. They're held in existence by God just as much as we are. It's not necessarily merely a deficiency. But his first encounter of reality is of a horizon that contains only lowered creatures. Woman's first encounter with reality is of a horizon that contains persons. Woman has never lived in a created order that's not already inhabited by persons. The first thing she sees is Adam's face. And it's only when woman appears that man knows who he is. In her glance, he sees himself. And with the appearance of woman, human community appears in human history for the first time. There is no possibility of self-gift without woman. So her gift to man is to say, I see you, and to call out of him the potential that he only barely was conscious of before she arrived. So St. Thomas would never have thought of the idea that woman would have had an infused knowledge, because woman wasn't on his radar screen in a certain way because of Aristotle and so on. But of course, she would have had infused knowledge also. And what was her contact with reality being one that's already inhabited by persons means that she saw into Adam, she saw his being. So my argument goes sort of like that. Usually I have more time and I can sort of unpack it really carefully, but I'm kind of throwing it out there for your consideration, that our concern about not reducing man and woman to stereotypes is a legitimate one. Where is this place to start? If you start in Genesis, Genesis reveals to us that man's gift is to unearth, unpack the goods of creation and put it in the service of their community. Woman's gift is to remind all of us that all human activity must be ordered toward authentic human flourishing. And then the last thing I want to say is that the Hebrew absolutely makes it clear that the first creature is male. She comes out of Adam's rib, right? So you can say that without man, woman has no place. And this makes everybody really nervous, but that's the clear meaning of the text. But what's gotten lost in all these centuries is that the flip side of that is that without woman, man has no future. So take your pick. There is no self-gift, there is no human community, there is no regard for persons without woman. And there's other ways of interpreting Genesis. But what's so important to me is that you can really declare these things by investigating Scripture. And I guess I want to just, in my own, I don't know if I need to say this or not, Mikhail Waldstein, who is the definitive translator and organizer of the Theology, he's like, this is fantastic. He was the first fellow to sign up for our institute on the study of man and woman. And he helped me with the Hebrew. He helped me with, he's, do you know what I'm trying to say? I realize it's kind of a novel idea, but it's also absolutely plausible. And I think it reveals much about what the sacred author was trying to tell us about man and woman. And I guess I have to stop now. I'm probably... Really? Are you serious? Are you really applauding or just feel sorry for me?
All right, this is quite a panel. All right, so I just took the question and tried to answer it. In answer to the question, is there a genius of woman, a true genius? I want to reply yes, but also to emphasize that the true genius of individual women may remain largely a potential rather than something actualized and manifested, due both to the fallenness of human nature and to failures in education, personal, communal, and institutional. Edith Stein, whose writings about woman certainly influenced Pope John Paul II, had a great deal to say to us about women's education. She recognized the innate gift of womanhood as a helomorphism, a unity of woman's soul and a woman's body, an inseparable unity that could nevertheless be disturbed or enhanced in manifold ways through external factors, the circumstances of our lives, the prescriptions of doctors, and our participation in the web of human relationships that attach us to persons, places, work, artistic expressions, political movements, philosophical ideas, and religious beliefs and practices. For Stein, the fruit of the educational process is, quote, the gestalt which the human personality assumes under the guidance of manifold external forces, unquote. Stein saw a proper education to be of crucial importance for the harmonious development of a woman's humanity, womanhood, and individuality. All educational work, according to Stein, aims at personality formation, and the whole course of instruction must be structured according to this goal. Education should bring out the best and the most beautiful in us. Indeed, Stein conceived of education as what Lisa Dowling calls a propedeutic to grace, something Stein viewed as crucial for the full realization of a person's potential. Blessed Basil Moreau similarly saw education as promoting the completeness of a person. Given education's high importance to Edith Stein, her acute analysis of the educational problems of her own time, her involvement already as an undergraduate student in different educational reform movements, and her own experiences later as a teacher in a Dominican high school for girls, it's not surprising that she wrote long, important essays in the 1930s about the principles of women's education and the problems of women's education. For Stein, a girl's education toward the perfect unfolding of her womanhood ideally begins at home, especially in the girl child's personal relationship to her mother. Nothing, Stein writes, can replace a girl's growing up near a mother who embodies authentic womanhood. If a girl loves and is loved by such a mother, is taught by such a mother, the girl's innate genius unfolds in this sort of primal atmosphere of love. She gradually acquires an experiential, connatural knowledge of womanhood through her own mother's way of being and acting. The father's love for the child's mother gives the child a deep sense of security and encourages her in her own growth toward womanhood. Unfortunately, Stein acknowledges, today, to a large degree, the home no longer fulfills its natural purpose. Often it achieves nothing, and what educational work it does achieve is often negative. Partly on that basis, Stein urged the possibility of family-like boarding schools for girls, in which virtuous women teachers would fulfill motherly roles vis-a-vis the students and thus compensate to some degree for what was lacking at home. Speaking to Catholic teachers, Stein exhorted them, "Our students do not need merely what we have, but rather what we are." She imagined, in short, a co-responsible situation in which noble-minded women would keep educating themselves toward the realization of their own ideal womanhood for the sake of their young students, and thus model for them the process of self-education to which the girls themselves were being called. As Lisa Dowling describes this path, all development is self-development, involving continual effort toward intellectual and moral development and the discovery of one's vocation in life. In Stein's understanding, education of young girls and women by motherly nurturing women, at least for a period of one's life, should strengthen the genius that is innate to them both, students and teachers alike. In addition to teachers as models of womanly caring and as a means for the students to grow in self-knowledge, Stein also recommended that the curriculum include books that presented to their young readers a list for empathetic understanding of others and through them of oneself. Adding titles to Stein's book list, which is a German list, such books might include Bildungsroman, such as Anne of Green Gables, or Little Women, or the novels of Jane Austen, fictions like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Rumer Godden's In This House of Breed, and Sigrid Undset's Kristin Lavransdatter, plays like Shakespeare's Winter's Tale and Sophocles' Antigone, biographies and autobiographies of women like Joan of Arc, Florence Nightingale, Harriet Tubman, Adele Quinn, Theresa Aletheia, Bernadette Subaru, Helen Keller, Mary Ward, and Gianna Molla, and I'm sure we could add a lot of names to this list. Above all, Stein pointed to the importance of fostering among young women a strong love and devotion to the Blessed Mother. We have seen the perfect ideal of woman exemplified by the Virgin Mother. If this ideal must be the goal of the entire education of girls in a spiritual sense, it will naturally be embodied in the woman who is the actual mother in a more intense and urgent way. In the other instance, the ideal of virginity is best exemplified where a virgin life is led. Stein speaks of a collaboration of Mary with every woman, wherever that woman is fulfilling her vocation as woman. We certainly need Mary's collaboration because without her, the obstacles to the full manifestation of women's genius are indeed great. Here, I cannot fail to mention, suspense, the importance of an educational movement like Schoenstatt and the organizations for girls and women who meet regularly and consciously strive to reflect a chosen ray of Mary's glories. Actually, I think the whole tradition of women's organizations like quilting societies and St. Anne societies and parishes where you would have a common task or something you all wanted to learn together. These are educational means too. But in these Schoenstatt groups, the women meet regularly and consciously choose to strive to reflect a chosen ray of Mary's glories. Okay, so they pick the name for their group, perhaps a title from a Marian litany or a Marian scene in Scripture, or some kind of scriptural symbol that to them symbolizes a Marian reality. And then they seal a covenant of love with Mary and with one another, asking Mary's intercession in their striving to follow her example in the concrete circumstances of their lives. Each one also discovers her own personal ideal, expressed in a word or a symbol, and develops a kind of program of striving that fits to that. The goal is their personal transformation into unique images of the Mother of God, to whom they have consecrated themselves, individually and in community, for the sake of others, like Mary lived her life, for the sake of others. Such groups for women and girls function like schools of sanctity. Like other women of her time, Stein set great hopes upon single-sex schools for women and girls. But how many of women's colleges today see it as their educational goal to form women to be women, to develop and to exercise their distinctive genius? Increasingly, the mission statements of traditionally women's colleges downplay that tradition in accord with revised admission policies that welcome students of the opposite sex who identify as women. At the same time, the female students at these campuses do not identify themselves as women, preferring to use a different nomenclature. So 61% of the students at Wellesley and 70% at Smith, these are traditionally women's colleges, now identify themselves as LGBTQ. The admission policy at Mount Holyoke states, as a women's college that is gender diverse. We welcome applications from female, transgender, and non-binary students. Salem College, the oldest continuously operative college for women, announces, quote, as a women's college in a society with changing understandings of gender identity and fluidity, Salem College strives to be a welcoming, gender-inclusive space while focusing our experience on those who are female or who identify as such. Alverno College, Franciscan college, admits students who live and identify as female regardless of their biological sex. And students assigned female at birth who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, they're also to be admitted. 23 historically women's colleges have policies that admit at least some trans students. And among Catholic colleges for women, St. Mary's College here in South Bend is the only one not to consider a trans applicant for admission. Admissions policies such as these are in themselves an external factor in the education of young women, teaching them that a woman is not a human person who possesses her body and soul as a unity. Ours is certainly a time of educational turmoil, of rapid institutional change, and of experimentation. The COVID years proved to be a boon to Catholic parochial schools. Homeschooling and charter schools are now seen as thriving alternatives to public education. There's an ongoing revival of classical Catholic schools. It may be that now is the time for new schools for girls and women, schools where women's genius can be nurtured, woman by woman, girl by girl. Neighborhoods and parishes where schools have closed might be places for a new beginning with a new vision. And existing Catholic schools might discover ways to be more intentional in their fostering of the genius of women and girls. This is a timely, important, urgent work, and I hope that this conference will spark our imagination about how to move forward.
You've heard a lot from me this morning, so I'm not going to talk for long. I just want to drop another experimental idea on you that I'm working through. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from an essay in progress that I'm working on that is trying to get at an understanding of what I call in the essay masculinity and femininity that's truly generative. not just in a physical way, but also in a spiritual way, because of course we are unities of body and soul. So this is, in a way, I'm kind of getting at the masculine and feminine genius thing idea, but with different terminology. But I think in some ways, it can be helpful in trying to articulate that to look at its dark mirror. What does it look like when femininity and masculinity become degenerative, when the genius perhaps becomes thwarted or twisted? And so one of the ideas that's helpful for understanding these few paragraphs is that I make the claim that generative masculinity and femininity can best be described as the living out of one's sex that sets the conditions for the flourishing of those entrusted to one's care, so the flourishing of those in one's sphere of influence. And the most fundamental condition for flourishing for human beings requires an environment of love that also allows for self-differentiation. So I'll read a couple paragraphs here. To better capture what I'm describing as generative masculinity and femininity, perhaps it would be helpful to gaze into its dark mirror. What does it look like when masculinity and femininity are degenerative, when a woman or man moves through the world in a way that inhibits flourishing? Our current cultural moment loves to ruminate about toxic masculinity, a kind of macho entitlement run amok. Other historical moments have had corollary obsessions with vice in a female mode. Take the chorale de femme, the quarrel of women, a late medieval dispute about the corrupting influence of women. And even earlier, many of the ancient Greek dramas harbor a deep-seated masculine anxiety about the feminine, right? You have Medea's kind of child-immolating triumph over Jason. You have Clytemnestra's man-killing coup. The masculine power in these plays is a precarious one, a power always under threat by a subterranean undercurrent of subdued feminine power that could erupt violently at any moment. But any narrative that frames one sex as more villainous than the other misunderstands the corruption of the human heart, which both sexes share. In other words, both masculinity and femininity can become toxic. But I'm wondering if, I want to suggest that, on the whole, we do so in different ways. Our distinct geniuses also present respective weaknesses or perversions. The man by nature stands apart from his offspring. This gives him a kind of generative transcendence, and when rightly stewarded, creates an environment of security and freedom within which the other can fully and freely develop her potential. When corrupted, this fruitful distance becomes disconnection. The other as person becomes other as object and is abandoned entirely or becomes something to use. We see degenerative masculinity in the absent father or the ghosting hookup, and certainly in the realm of porn. All of these forms of masculinity are sterile, both in the literal sense of being antithetical to life and in the more expansive sense of inhibiting the flourishing of the one who is abandoned, the one who is discarded. The freedom, that intersubjective distance that I'm going to say is part of, if you want to say it, the masculine genius, part of male embodiment, that freedom intrinsic to male generativity becomes extended and perverted into a loveless chasm. There's thus a temptation within male generative potential, a temptation to forsake what he should embrace. There's a corollary temptation for women. In the beginning, mother-child relation has no distance. There is only connection, a sharing of blood and breath, a knitting together of two embodied souls. Even after birth, the human infant, so helpless compared to other animals, is dependent upon the maternal body for sustenance and love. The survival of the child relies upon this interpersonal fusion, this all-encompassing bond. But at some point, in order to remain generative, the cosmic presence of the mother has to recede. She must let herself be eclipsed. She must withdraw herself in order to let the selfhood of her child bloom. This is not an abandonment or a withdrawal of love. It is a making space that sets the conditions for a love that is free. In a femininity that becomes degenerative, her genius of interpersonal connection twists into a pseudo-love that extinguishes the differentiation between other and self. I think we often can see this in two distinct modes. On the one hand, an erosion of self-differentiation that subsumes the other, that stifles his development in an engulfing embrace. This is manifest in the overprotective and controlling mother, whose love is colonized by fear and becomes a kind of padded cell, seemingly soft and comfortable, but ultimately a prison. She encloses what she should set free. The inverse of the smothering mother, another mode of degenerative femininity, is the woman who totally loses herself in another. The beloved becomes her whole world. He is an ocean into which her selfhood dissolves. Rather than subsuming, she becomes subsumed. She's the mythic figure of Echo who can only speak by parroting back someone else's words. Degenerative masculinity and femininity, as described here, become manifest in a pathological excess of our distinct generative geniuses. That's kind of the main idea I'm testing out here. There's either too much distance between self and other or not enough. And either condition makes authentic love possible, where there has to be this freedom and space, but also the distance is crossed through love. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to do about 20 minutes or so of moderated discussion among the panelists, and then kind of open it up to leave about 10 to 15 minutes of broader Q&A. So I am a philosopher, and so I actually get really excited when I see interesting and potentially fruitful disagreement among panelists. So I'm not going to make any attempt as moderator to cover that over. I actually think I want to start out by inviting further discussion of that, because I think that's actually what people are interested in hearing. So let me start with how I understand the apparent disagreement, at least, and then invite all the panelists, but beginning with Deborah and Abigail to say how they respond to that. So the way I have understood Abby's presentation before and then Deborah's now is that Abby's presentation seems to say the only truly binary universal differences between men and women go back to their differences with regard to generation, right? The differences in terms of the biology of reproduction and the distinctive male and female roles in reproduction. And then anything kind of further removed from that, kind of higher level, as Abby was saying before, you'll find perhaps differences on average that relate to hormones, but also nurture and other sorts of things. So they're related to the underlying biology, but to the extent that you get further away from the basic biological difference, you're going to find much more variability, and then you need to be open to recognizing that a lot of the characteristics that we associate with male versus female are averages, and perhaps even less significant as averages than many have thought, although that's an empirical question. So did I get you more or less right? Okay, so, and then it looks like Deborah's picture, trying to dive deep into what Genesis 2 in particular is revealing to us, wants to claim a stronger level of difference at the level of gifts beyond the mere biological complementarity, or at least that's what I took to be implied, and maybe you can correct me. But the idea that the first creature is in Genesis 2 is male, and that there's then this distinctive, creative, outside the self gift of the male as male by comparison with the distinctive gift of the female as female, which is more person-oriented and teaches the man who he is as a person and makes possible reciprocal self-gift, would seem to indicate perhaps more of a claim of essential difference at the level of characteristics beyond the biological. So yeah, so I would just invite, again, beginning with Deborah and Abby, to see, am I getting that right? And if so, what are we to make of those differences, or how much can each of you take your own, take the other's view on board, or how much does each of you think, there's a danger in the other's view? So.
Yeah, just some initial thoughts. I think maybe the biggest, well, the first kind of maybe difference point that jumps out to me, I think in terms of at least the empirical question of the things versus people distinction. This is a distinction I've also read research on. And basically, to kind of put it in simple language, if I were to kind of look at this room and then pick a random male, pick a random female, and say, male, and Josiah, I'm looking at you. Josiah, you're more interested in things, all right, you're more interested in people. I would have a 65% chance of being right and a 35% chance of being wrong. So that is significant, right? There's a difference there, and it's a difference that, again, I think on the aggregate level really shows up more strongly. But I don't think it's an absolute difference. So I would kind of classify that, at least in the terms of my presentation, as a second order difference. And thus, perhaps I would be reticent to ground the masculine genius or the feminine genius in that distinction. That said, I do think my interpretation of the feminine genius, which is rooted in embodiment, does make the claim that there is something about female embodiment that has, again, a kind of prophetic witness to the dignity, importance of the person, the kind of absolute dignity of the person. So I think there's some truth in there. But I really think that the Genesis creation story, I really follow John Paul II's interpretation of that the point of sexual difference there is not in kind of landing in these sort of separate tasks for men and women, but sexual difference is about communion and reciprocal self-gift. And in some ways, an important aspect of sexual difference is just this constant reminder to the other sex that you are not God, right? That you are not this kind of self-sustaining autonomy, that you're made for communion, right? And so that is kind of my interpretation of what that Genesis creation story is really the culmination. If you think about it just as like a text in terms of a narrative arc, the climax of that story is that moment when both men and women exist, when maleness and femaleness is first proclaimed in kind of a poetic, almost song form in the text. And so it's sexual differentiation because of the capacity for communion and reciprocal gift. That's where the accent is. And so I don't necessarily agree with then kind of pushing it further into men are more oriented toward things. And that's kind of the masculine genius, is to kind of be about creation, and the women. I think also Genesis 1, there's very much a common mission, a common orientation of both sexes toward creation. And so I think that's where maybe I see the differences in my reading most pronounced, but yeah.
Okay, I guess this is where you're supposed to argue, right? I want to say first, I'm not sure that I disagree fundamentally with anything that you've said, except this business about 65% of the people, and forgive me, Abigail, but you can't have it both ways. There's either some truth in this characterization that I'm offering or not. And I think and again, I'm somewhat schooled in the neuroscience and the ways in which the differences between male and female brains, the way the hormones affect all that. Like, for example, man's a greater risk taker, more interested in sex, because the amygdala, which governs such things in the male brain, is like 50% larger than it is in the female brain. And there's all sorts of things that drive these distinctions. It's just the evidence is really clear. Like, within 4 hours of birth, a little girl will distinguish between the sound of a baby's cry and somebody dropping a fork on the floor. Little girls, infant girls, will look at your face. If you speak with them for any length of time, they'll look at it longer. The little boys are looking at the mobile above their head. They don't really care whether you talk to them or not. When in preschool situations, when a new box of toys arrive, the little boys jump up and unpack them. The little girls are still in their little circle talking to each other. But when new kids arrive, the girls jump up and go and see how can we welcome you. The little boys are over there playing, looking like, oh, big deal. Whenever you feel like it, come and join us if you want. There's so many this is all empirically demonstrated by sociological studies, psychological studies, etc. So my effort has not been to articulate stereotypical behaviors at all, but to show that Genesis reveals that there is an orientation toward the world that informs man and woman forever after. If you understand the significance of the first encounter with reality that is articulated, I think, there, or that one sees there, in the unfolding of the created order, it supports for sure, I'd say, it reveals that there's a place in Scripture to sort of locate these tendencies that men have to varying degrees, admittedly, and that women tend to have. There's a place in Scripture that explains it, that offers an account. It's unmistakable that man's task in the garden is revealed to be one of working and tilling the garden. His grasp of the nature of reality is profound. I guess I do count a lot on Aquinas on this, in that he's articulating that man had a distinct gift, etc. The unfortunate thing is he doesn't also then think, well, wait a minute, what was woman's? So one is generally, you could say, marked forever after by one's encounter with reality in the first instance, and it's different for both of them. So, things, for example, that happen in your early childhood forever mark you. We know this from psychological studies. And so in terms of atomistic epistemology, this grasp of reality that both seem to have is instrumental in shaping not necessarily their specific behaviors or attributes, but just a general outlook on the world. Now, why does this matter? This matters because JP2 says it's our complementarity that gives us our mission, which he says is to create not only human families, but human history. And what's at stake really is the future of civilization, because as anybody who's familiar with, like, The Flight from Woman by Carl Stern, this obsession with technology, with doing, with making, what Ratzinger refers to as the masculine principle, is a Western, he calls it a Western mentality that's only interested in activity, in doing, in church programs that are endless. Let's set up another program, all those sorts of things. What's overlooked in all that, there's two principles governing the church. Maybe this will help the Apostolic Petrine and the Marian. These are two principles that govern the church. The Apostolic Petrine is more visible. It's with, the priesthood, the transcendent, if you will. And the Marian principle is the inner life of the church, the heart of the church. Without the Marian principle, it's just a bunch of guys running around in black suits. He says the church is a manufactured item without woman. And he absolutely refers to this distinction between men's tendency, maybe because of original sin, where it goes south, and woman's gift, which is to remind everybody about the heart, right? So I think I loved your paper, and I have to admit, I'm only now unpacking the rest of the theology of the body. I kind of stopped at those first two audiences and went, okay, I don't know whatever else, it's unbelievable. You're absolutely right. Your description of what's going on in the TOB is fabulous, and it's just so profound. But it doesn't preclude a grasp of what Genesis is trying to communicate. Now, The thing, here's another wrinkle on this that you may not have studied. Hebraic anthropology is absolutely essential to understanding this properly, because in Hebraic anthropology, the understanding that's contained within that of the soul leads to a grasp of something that's called the corporate personality. The Israelites Semitic author would have understood that, in fact, man already contains woman, because there's an oscillation between the one and the many always going on in the Hebraic understanding of the soul. So the individual contains the many, and that includes both ancestors and future generations. And the many are reflected in the one. So woman is actually prefigured in man already in Genesis 2. She emerges out of the reality the Semitic author would have understood. She emerges out of the unity already prefigured in Adam. So if you look, for example, at Michelangelo's famous painting of God touching man and the creation story right there, you look at that fresco. If you look carefully in the cloud behind God's head, where there's cherubs and stuff, there is woman. And that Michelangelo understood that woman is prefigured in Adam. And so when you say Genesis 1 reveals the equal dignity of man and woman, that's absolutely true, because the meaning of the word Adam means man in the collective sense, in a phrase that needs to be interpreted through the lens of Hebraic anthropology. So there's so much work to be done with that. They really want to understand, and in a way this is all I'm trying to get at, the Semitic author's trying to tell us something. And the stuff about, well, there's these attributes and there's 65% of them, or this, that, or the other thing, I don't care. I actually don't care. Because what I'm discovering is that God is the author of all truth. That the scientific account of man and woman that can be constructed out of the neuroscience and the psychological data and the sociological data and all, women self-select when it comes to sociology into the caring professions, not because they're forced to, but because that's how they're built. And I think that it's really essential, and we can continue to argue and debate and everything, and I don't throw my theory out, let's come up with another one. We have to figure this out, because we're losing our civilization. And I'd say it's because men and women don't understand each other. We laugh about our husbands because they forget where they put their cell phones, and men laugh about us because we make things so complicated. And actually, we're two ships passing in the night. So I think that you can make the case, in spite of your other view, which I love, I want to talk further, that women are oriented toward persons. I mean, a baby comes into the room, the women are like, whoa. The men are, so what did that guy say again? It's just so clear, isn't it? Yeah, okay. So the philosopher always asks, I rest my case, everybody agrees with me. No, the philosopher always has to ask why, how, what's the origin of this? Obvious fact, yeah.
Okay, so I know we could go
Wait
on
a
a
second,
very long time on this, but so again, I do want to give a chance for our other panelists if they want to speak to this particular topic.
I'm trying to save the world here, that's all. No big deal.
No, either of you want to? Oh, sorry, yes, here, take the...
I'm sorry, sister.
I was just struck by a commonality between your two presentations in when Abigail talks about the fallenness and how it affects differently the generativity of man and woman, it seems to correlate pretty well with the freedom factor, right? That involves sort of a walking away. It can involve a sort of walking away from the personal, right? The bond there. Yep. And then the heavy accent on the personal bond that can go to limit freedom, right, in a terrible way, actually, that women could be susceptible to. Yes. And so those are the two things that you were highlighting in my reading. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying that now I have to repeat. That the orientation toward the outside world, which Dr. Savage was talking about for man, and the orientation toward persons for women, kind of does support, to some extent, right, the profile that Abigail gave us of degenerate masculinity and degenerate femininity.
For me, I think there's so much complementarity in what we're saying because we're entering into a paradox. So I think for myself, I'm thinking that in this time and in this moment, I think it's very important to focus on not the secondary traits, but the primary and the embodied experience. And I think that for me is coming from just a contemplation of what is happening in terms of trans identity and people who identify as trans. And I think oftentimes in these conversations, those people and that ideas are scapegoated. And, Francis says it's an ideology. But I also think we can use ideological thinking to combat ideological thinking, and it's just as unhelpful. I think when we create this binary of gender, which I think has happened since the feminist movement, kind of in reaction to the feminist movement, I think maybe we, as Christians, we need to take responsibility for what that has created in some ways, this idea that there's such stark differences that if you are born female and you feel like you're male, then you feel like you have to change your body. And I think that there's been in some ways, a responsibility that we hold for that reality that people feel.
Yeah, I agree with that very much, and I would say that I'm not suggesting a disembodied orientation. I think it's built, like John Paul II says, that the feminine genius is grounded in the fact that all women are meant to be mothers. And that gives them a particular orientation toward the person. I think this is indisputable. What I'm arguing is that there's actually a prior point of departure for that claim, which is that she is created, at the moment at which she's created is revelatory of self-gift, is revelatory of the fact of human community. Just think about man all by himself. He's useless. He's just gonna, it's the subroutine without a function, we used to call it. That there's just all doing and there's no love, there's no gift, there's no giving, receiving, as Abigail so well articulated. And so woman is, in a way, this was my goal, is how to deal with the second sex issue, right? In fact, if you look at the whole created order, woman is not created second, she's created last and on the way up. Usually people, there's not enough guys in the audience. They usually go, wait a second. But it's a zer kenegdo. Kenegdo is a preposition meaning in front of in the spatial sense. They're face to face, and they both occupy pride of place in the created order. Yes, man gives me my place. We've all felt it. He's the head of the household. He's in the garden with God for a while. He's the author of the family. That's why he's responsible for it. But without woman, there is no family. Without woman, there is no future. And that's really what we have to help men see, is that we occupy a place in whatever that quote was from Vatican II. And, really, that's just different, So
we should probably move to broader Q&A here. There's a very long line.
I'm sorry.
But thank you for that back and forth. So let's go to the Q&A here.
Oh, thank you so much. I would love to contextualize my question, but I'm going to keep it short because there's a lot of people behind me. It strikes me that a lot of the dissonance that we're hearing in these conversations is precisely because we're talking about mankind at different states right? Prelapsarian man, postlapsarian man, redeemed mankind, right? The vision of eschatological man. It strikes me that where the crux of the matter is this redeemed man and redeemed woman and the reclaiming of who we were before, this anamnesis, this unforgetting of what we lost in the fall. And it strikes me that this feminine genius, right, is unique in how we as women need to unforget our nature as distinct from men, because we grapple with our bodies in a way that men don't. This unforgetting, this re-understanding of who we are so that we can become eschatological women, fully human, right? Eventually has to tangle with this anamnesis with the body. And so I would love to hear you all reflect or offer some initial thoughts on how the moment we're in right now, as redeemed women who have this task of picking up the pieces, go about that fundamental regathering of our identity.
In 30 seconds each.
Oh, you're waiting? Whoever wants to start. Okay, so I love the word anamnesis, and I absolutely, completely agree with you. We have this feeling that we know that there's more, right? Or however you want to articulate it. Abigail and my understanding of what happens in original sin is exactly the same. I just would say it in different language, but we lose the gifts that we were given. You can't understand what goes on at the fall if you don't understand really what exactly were the gifts we had. And now man treats everything as an object, including woman, and woman's gift, which was relationship, is now encumbered by this idea that she will desire her husband even though she knows he's using her. Yeah. So the way back is actually to understand what you just said. I'm trying to recover, but through understanding what Genesis is telling me, or what JP2 is telling me in the theology of the body, who I am is being illuminated to me. And so I don't know what else to add. I guess I'd say yes.
Anybody else want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think, I heard a homily recently where the priest said, well, how wonderful it is that we can look at the first 2 chapters of Genesis because that's the only scriptural witness we have to before the fall, right? And the rest of Scripture, right, gives us the fallen condition, right? But in the fullness of time, though, all right, the Word was made flesh. The Virgin Mary appeared on the scene as the cause of our hope, and our faith tells us that she was the new Eve before the fall, right? And so to really understand our womanly nature, we can't only look at Genesis 1 and 2, although we can't disregard them. You have to read them together with the New Testament revelation. And the other point I would like to make, and this is to kind of, I didn't have enough time in my talk yesterday to talk about this, but the genius of place, right? It's paradise, right? So to the extent to which we can build educational spaces where there's an atmosphere that's joyful, that's pure, that's uplifting, where there's love, right? Things will unfold there, like almost miraculously, right? Because we haven't lost our nature, right? So there's still something, that can flower again. And so, yes, but so the small environments, your own home, right? Can that be a paradise place? Your circle of friends, can we aspire to create a kind of paradise atmosphere where new men and new women, can blossom, as a foretaste of heaven and as a sign of hope, to our world.
Just really briefly, your comment makes me think of, I'm reading Luigi Giussani right now, and he has a quote related to what I just said about ideological thinking, that ideology is opposed to memory. Like, we lose our memory when we think in that way. And I think that is the danger of our time. Like, we're surrounded by a lot of ideological thinking, but I think that the pitfall for Christians is that we fall into ideological thinking in opposition to it. And so to remain in the nuance, to remain in the paradox, to remain in confusing other people, to remain in that area where maybe they're wondering, are you Orthodox? Are you, stay there. Stay in the complexity of the situation, because I think that's where we're called to be right now.
So as the mother of a son, I want to ask a question that's pushing back a little on this person-oriented, thing-oriented thing as at the heart of our sexes. Yes, he's very thing-oriented at the moment. Because I'm concerned about what it means for men. First of all, that if we take an eschatological point of view, persons are higher than things. That we better image God in persons and things, and I'm worried that framing this, doesn't reflect the equal dignity of men and women. But then I'm also worried on a practical level that we live in a society now that is increasingly less thing-oriented. And that when men are kind of steered towards thing professions or told that that's the most at the heart of their masculinity, that we see this increasing number of deaths of despair of men who don't find manufacturing jobs that used to exist, thank you, don't see that sense of purpose and may feel cut off from living a life that is more person-oriented, as my husband does as a high school teacher. So does this person-thing strong orientation rather than statistical tendency really give men sufficient reason for their hope?
Yeah, I think that helps to name maybe some of my reticence too, because I really read Genesis as primarily about, again, the formation of a communion of persons. So I think the accent is on the person. And I think, in fact, the whole Parade of Animals arc is the fact that what is lacking there is a person. The fact that he can't have communion with these other creatures. So there's, even again, in just a narrative sense, what's driving the conflict in the narrative is that the first human is lacking a person with whom he can have communion. That's what he's seeking. That's not what's not quite right. And that's fulfilled in the creation of woman. So I find the whole narrative to be very much like oriented toward the personal in my reading, and I think in John Paul II's reading. I also have to pee really bad. I'm sorry if I look pained on my face, that's what's going on. Anyway, sorry.
So I just want to offer one quick comment, I guess, that I understand what you're saying, and also would agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, Abby, that the tension is because there isn't another person, and so when there is a person, everything is clear, right? The fall throws everything off, and that's what we lose is this orientation toward persons that leads to all that you are describing. So what I'm getting at, though, is this, that it's not that the orientation toward things business that's reductionist, actually, not the point. Man's task is to protect and to provide. And it's, I would say, in the first part of Genesis 1 and 2, or 2, this is what he's sorted out. He's saying, when woman appears, he now sees, okay, I'm an expert on creation. I know what things are for. So what? And she appears, and now he knows that whatever his gifts were, whatever his task was in the garden, he's got that task now because he's to serve her. And so, yes, men have this second step they have to take. They do forget about persons, don't they? This is well, they do, though. I mean, if you call your husband, maybe you're lucky, and your husband isn't like, well, no. I don't mean to.
Such an exemplar that other men can't reach.
No. I don't. Maybe I just have difficulty articulating it. I don't know, because I actually have never had to face this sort of thing. It's really great for me. But my husband, just as an example, call him in from the garage where he's working on God only knows how many projects. Come in for dinner, it's time for dinner, the children are around the table, please come. 5 times you have to call him, right? And one time, Andrew, finally, your husband's different. Then you're lucky. But a lot of husbands are not. They're interested in this project. It's really important. Woman, just leave me alone. Let me know when the dinner's actually on the table, on the plate. And what I say to women is, no, your task is to remind him that it's time to come in because it's time for the family. Yeah. So I'm not really addressing this, but I do have that concern. I think what I would say is that if you look around you and the obsession with technology, all the things that we're continually having to buy because somebody invented something new, this is evidence that this particular disorder, if you will, needs to be seen for what it is. It's a distortion of man's real gift. We're both the same DNA, 98.9% the same DNA. It shouldn't surprise anyone that men and women can do a lot of the same things. So I'm just trying to suggest that there's a different orientation, not a behavior, not a, okay, I'm just repeating myself now.
Okay, so one last brief question with brief answers.
Speed round.
I get to talk tomorrow. So we all have the same general position over here. So I want to bring you two together.
Yeah, thank you.
Because I think you're both coming up from the body, but that, Deborah, your frame is actually something that Abigail spoke about, which is the iconic, symbolic level. And that's what you're most concerned about. And I think there's a richness in your description because of icon.
Yeah.
And because of what you just said, reductive, like that there's a way in which your explanation of the two can be reduced, especially in a post-Lapsarian context, where men can be only thinking about objects, objectifying, which is actually how Abby put it. I think Abby is concerned with actual individual women on the ground and individual men on the ground, which is also Leah's concern, which is also my concern, because of the way in which we can take a normative, iconic framework and push it on to others so that we get to the trans problem. And so this is how I want to test this. So we have some incredibly systematic thinking women in this room. There's a couple on the panel. I'm going to point to Melissa in particular because I know her work really well.
Can I just say as a total joke, so I'm hesitant to say this on camera, but there are conversations I have with my husband where he, again, very jokingly says, "You're sure you're not a man?"
Yeah. So this is so incredible systematic. Her work, if you Melissa.
No, I know.
And also we have a mathematician and Leah, incredible systematic thinking. So this is what I want to ask.
Yeah.
To me, they are gifted women, right?
Yeah.
And what I want to ask is, would you say that Melissa or Leah or me as an athlete, like a really talented athlete, we're women with traditionally masculine attributes? Or if my husband, who actually is the one who runs to the baby, and I run to the conversations with the men about philosophy, does he have traditionally feminine attributes that make him sort of more feminine? To me, this is integration. And I see this as this is actually the call is for each to be integrated.
Yes.
And so that is on a personal level. And so the last thing I'll say is with regard to being a lawyer and anti-discrimination law, what anti-discrimination law does is protects the exceptions, right? So we like norms, that's good, but that those exceptions need to be protected. So the woman who has to be are you really a man? Should we can we hire you in the philosophy department? These kinds of things, right? That's what anti-discrimination law protects, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess that's where I want to push you, because I think you're giving a beautiful account of symbol and icon that is really beautiful. I think you heard a lot of people sort of hearing you, and there's something right there. Yeah. And I think that's at the level up here of symbol, not abstraction, but symbol. And then there's a level of, well, I've already said it, but there's the level of the actual person who I've been told forever too that I'm there's no lack of testosterone here when I sat down at but I'm a woman. And in fact, I think, and hold on. And I actually think, and I've said this to you before, that an account that is fully bodied, fully about the body and asymmetries of the body, that everything comes out of that, is actually taking sex differences way more seriously than an account that is performative, that is about what women tend to do. So that's all.
Oh, wait a second now. did you just call me my theory performative?
No, but
Oh,
we do see an account of like, and I'm just going to quote someone, but like, women, it's beauty.
No,
and women, it's strength.
All right. Okay.
Sorry, I'm not talking about you, Deborah, but there is.
No, I know. This is where I get to quote the immortal Helen Alvarez, who said years ago, what we don't need is a pink theology. Okay? And we don't. And this is, both of us are working to avoid that for sure. Because the notion of the feminine genius has become romanticized. It's kind of like, so is complementarity. It's a romantic notion. It's actually a feature of creation itself. Anybody here heard of quantum physics? I mean, wave and particle theory, et cetera. So there's a lot. It's JP2 has in mind Polish women, not women, white women on their patio drinking Chardonnay while their husbands light the grill. It's, no, women who know stuff. And so, sorry, that might have come out wrong. Women who know how to light a damn fire. Okay. No, really, I mean, this just drives me crazy. So, gosh, there's so many stories, but.
Deborah, just
what?
How about just to answer the question about,
okay,
like, would you refer, and I just want to, because I think this is a way of testing this. It's like, would you refer, sorry, Melissa, you're right up there. Would you refer to Melissa, who has, like, a high capacity for systematization as traditionally masculine? Like, is she you know what I mean?
Well,
does she have traditionally masculine?
This feels like a trick question to me.
So then, and you don't have to answer it yes or no. I'm not. I want to like complexify it. Right?
I want to say that those are understood to be traditionally masculine things. Yes, but here's what I think. I have this notion that is in my theory, which is I've written about, called mutual begetting. That the whole task of being human, it's not fractional complementarity, okay, just so you know. But there's this way in which each of us has potencies that have not yet been actualized. In you as an athlete, those potencies were actualized, right? And they seem like they're men's, but no, they're not really, they're human. They're human potencies, okay? So, and you could apply that to just about every example you just gave. So, marriage is a place where my potencies are actualized, so that the mutual begetting that goes on between husband and wife is that each of you becomes sort of more complete, who you're meant to be, which is the glory of God fully alive, right? So does that kind of not really settle it, but because it's already been said, it's so profound. There's me as human, me as a woman, and then me as me. And so there's these three it's a multivalent notion who I am. And so you can't really, as Sister just said, it remains a kind of mystery. But I want to end by just saying this one thing. Someone sent me a podcast, a young man who had decided not to transition. And he was being asked, why did you decide not to transition? This was the whole point of the podcast. And he said, well, first of all, I discovered Jesus Christ. So that was kind of a big deal. But he said this, and the second breath, and I don't mean to, this may sound like a brag, it's not. It's proof of my theory. He said, but the other reason was because I heard Dr. Deborah Savage give this talk about man and woman. I had never heard man and woman described that way, and it gave me hope. That is a quote. And I think, whatever our differences here, that the reason that we're in the mess we are right now is because we did not have, and still don't, an adequate account of the nature of man in relation to woman and vice versa. There is none on offer in our tradition. And we have to fill in that gap to some extent, remaining in the mystery, not without reducing us to stereotypes. It's really a challenge. So whatever we do next, it's got to include that project. That's been my project.
Okay, so with that challenge, I send you all to lunch to continue the conversation.